Okay, so chapter 9 is a lot. And this is one of those situations where if you just watched the movie, it does the message and it does what it's supposed to do, but you miss this part. And chapter 9 to me is the beauty of all of these things tying together. And this perfect, not perfect because platonic conception, but this amazing metaphor that is The Great Gatsby that makes this book timeless. I had to change out of my t-shirt because, as you guys know, I'm always freezing and it's like 70 degrees outside, but my husband is Persian and so he's always hot. So he has turned the AC up and I am freezing. I have a heater on at my feet right now because I'm so cold. And I'm drinking hot coffee because I'm so cold. So that's neither here nor there. Let's go back to the end of chapter 8, where we actually see the death of Gatsby. So last paragraph on 162, it says there was a faint, second to last paragraph, there was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With the little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course and its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing like a leg of transit a thin red circle in the water. So this is Gatsby's body that's floating, and it is the idea of baptism and death, and we're going to see this idea of baptism repeated over and over again. The last paragraph on 162 says, it was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. So Wilson committed suicide. And then we've got chapter 9. So chapter 9 is where we see the ultimate sadness of Gatsby's life and Gatsby's death. And if you weren't reading closely, you could just read this chapter and be like, this is so sad. Like, he's by himself, and this guy that's only known him for like 3 months is basically, creating a funeral for him. No one wants to come. Daisy, the girl that he like built his life around, is basically, not even like acknowledging not only her role in his death, but also his death in general. Like, she doesn't even send a flower or a note for his funeral. She doesn't show up, like nothing. The only person that shows up to the funeral is old Owl Eyes and Jay's dad, and like his dad is the absolute opposite of him. So it would be easy for us to be like, oh, Fitzgerald's just writing how sad this is, but it's so much more than just how sad Jay's life is. So we start off with the idea that in death, just as when he was alive, Gatsby is isolated, right? He's serving to highlight his unique capacity for hope, but that unique capacity for hope is kind of like what sets him apart from everyone else. And so he's both simultaneously noble, but because he's tied this hope to the concept of money and prestige and power and all of those things, he's actually become kind of corrupt too. So Gatsby is sacrificed, right? Just like Myrtle was sacrificed. Well, not just like Myrtle was sacrificed, but Gatsby is sacrificed. And it's supposed to reveal that the American dream is corrupt, but the aspiration, the dream of it itself, the idea, before it becomes belief, that's actually noble. That's noble and worthwhile, right? So this chapter, if you didn't read it and you were just left with the movie where it's like this really sad music and the sad funeral scene and like no one shows up and you just left it at that, you would just leave with the idea that Fitzgerald is trying to tell people that like, oh, this sucks. Like, this is sad. Isn't this sad that this guy is, after everything he tried to do, just dies alone? Which you would link to existentialism. I mean, that's the one of the aspects of existential philosophy is that, even if you surround yourself with goodness your entire life and like making other people happy, in the end we all die alone. So, you could tie it that way. But again, when you read the actual paragraphs, when you read the actual chapter, there's so much more to it. There's so much more. So going further, we get, basically our narrator is just trying to get someone to care. Like, somebody needs to care about the fact that this wonderful man died, right? And Nick said, you're better than all of them. Like, you're the best of them. You're better than all of them. But no one really cares. And then that's further add insult to injury by George Wilson, and like the fact that what he was trying to do, George Wilson was trying to create some justice for Myrtle, and he's just dismissed as this crazy guy. Like, even Myrtle's sister is like, no, she never had an affair. She always loved George. I don't know what George is talking about, right? Her sister was at the party where she was all over Tom Buchanan. Like, her sister knew that she was having an affair. And yet her sister, and it says in there that her sister convinced herself, right? That her sister had come to the conclusion that she actually believed that Myrtle had never had the affair. So, like, truth is how you perceive it. That's the perception of it. We also find out on page 166 where it says when the phone rang that afternoon at a long distance in Chicago was calling, we find out that our suspicions about where Gatsby got his money are confirmed. He did basically get his money in untoward ways, right? So whether this is through gambling or bootlegging or whatever it was not through, I think he told Daisy that it was through like drugstores or something like that. That wasn't what it was through. And then on 167, we meet Gatsby's father. And Gatsby's father is the absolute opposite of Gatsby. So he's described as being very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long, cheap ulster against the warm September day. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement. And when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse gray beard that I had difficulty getting off his coat. So Gatsby's always described as being like cool and collected, and like, you know, he never sort of shows any emotion, and if he does show emotion, he very quickly like sucked it up and deals with it. And his father is the opposite of that. His father is poor. His father has too much emotion. His father is all jumbly, right? He's affected by even by the weather. Like, Gatsby was never affected by the weather. Remember, Daisy always talked about how cool he looked in the heat, right? And how she's like, oh, you look like an advertisement. You're so cool and collected in this heat. Whereas his father's like deeply affected by everything. And then at the end of that same chapter, it says, but he wouldn't eat, and a glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. So remember, milk is always supposed to represent the idea of parenthood. So in this instance, it's that he has spilt his purpose as a parent. It's tumbled, and it hasn't come to fruition. We also find out that Jimmy is what James Gatz went by, so his identity is further revealed as not being this projection of James Gatz or Jay Gatsby, that it's actually Jimmy. And so like, we are revealing the past through the vision of the present, right? On page 168, we find out some other things, and basically Gatsby, the whole purpose of page 168 is to show how Gatsby is so different from his father, right? And we already knew that, because at the very beginning of the book, it says, quote, his imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all, right? So James is not Jimmy, is not Jay, right? And so we have all of these persona, and, you know, Gatz, he says the only thing that his father knows is his own identity, which is interesting because that's also opposite of Gatsby. So his dad says, Gatz is my name, and that seems to be the only thing that he's certain about, right? Whereas Gatsby, his identity was one of the things that seemed to sort of transcend whatever situation he was in. In this instance, Gatz, his father, is the only one that seems to know that. I know for certain. Like, that's one of the things that I know to be true. And basically, 169, his closest friends have completely abandoned him. You know, Wolfsheim. So I skipped over, you know, there's one point where Carraway goes and visits Wolfsheim, and it's this very confusing scene where it's like a swastika on the door, and there's like references to like a Jewess, and like, I'll be perfectly honest, guys, like, I read that and I don't know why Fitzgerald included it, other than to show that, like, with classism, there is a religious component too, right? Meaning that, like, anti-Semitism has always existed as a way to other people, and so, like, maybe that was part of it. but the whole thing was so confusing, and like the way that he did it was just kind of, I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. So if you figure it out, please let me know, because it was a little over the top for me. So moving further into the chapter, we have all of these sort of like paradoxical notions of what Gatsby's father knows him to be true as, right? So Gatsby's father on page 173 goes through this like schedule that Gatsby had for himself, and like Gatsby's father is like walking around with it like it's a holy grail, like it like perfectly describes his son, even more so than his actual son, right? And there's a thoroughness to the plan, and it's like rise from bed at 6 a.m., you know, work out 6:15 to 6:30, study electricity, so like do schoolwork from 7:15 to 8:15, so on and so forth. There's such a thoroughness to this plan that it belies someone who has a purpose in creating the dream to be real. So Gatsby had this schedule set for himself when he was James Gatz. So he's like, well, how will I become J. Gatsby? This is how I will do it. And he sets forth this plan, these goals, right? And so for him, for James Gatz, the idea of Gatsby or achieving the American dream, you know, it's simple. You follow the plan, right? It's like reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Like you read this book and you do these things, and therefore you will create the American dream for yourself, right? But that's kind of the problem with the paradox of philosophy, right? Even if you achieve that thing, it's not going to live up to your Platonic conception of what you thought it would mean. On 174, we have the actual funeral procession, and the person that shows up besides the father is Owl Eyes. And you might have been asking yourself, why on earth did Fitzgerald have Owl Eyes? Owl Eyes is supposed to represent truth without opinion attached to it. He's supposed to represent, like, if this is perception, this is actual truth. So it says, and it's the last sentence in the third paragraph on 174. It was the man with the owl eye glasses whom I had found marveling over Gatsby's book in the library one night 3 months before. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how he knew about the funeral or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses. So again, that's going to be the idea of baptism, just like with the baptism of the pool. And now we have the baptism of the rain. And he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. All right, so remember I told you, like, unless you read the book, you're not going to get this. It's perfect. It's so sad, but it's so perfect. So bottom of page 174, this is Owl Eyes, and he says to Nick, and remember, Owl Eyes is supposed to represent truth. Owl Eyes says, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on." And then the owl-eyed man said, "Amen to that," in a brave voice. We straggled down quickly through the rain to the cars. Owl Eyes spoke to me by the gate. I couldn't get to the house, he remarked. Neither could anybody else. "Go on," he started. "Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds." He took off his glasses, remember glasses supposed to represent your perception of the world, and wiped them again outside and in. "The poor son of a bitch," he said. Poor. Think about all of the meanings of that word, poor. In this instance, poor as in like alone by himself. No one is bothering to come to his funeral. Poor. He didn't have the moral fortitude to have any other higher aspiration or dream other than to just get rich and get the girl. Poor. He's got no real wealth because he's dead. You can't take it with you when you die. Poor. Even his identity isn't real, because remember, Owl Eyes knew. Owl Eyes was going through that library and he was like, these books look like they're real. You know, all of this seems like it's real, but it's not real. None of it's real, because Owl Eyes knows the truth. So he's poor. The poor son of a bitch, Gatz, Jimmy Gatz, is the poor son of a bitch because he doesn't have any of those things. So the idea of poverty, and it takes us back to the very first line of the book where it says not everyone has the same privileges you do. it's not necessarily about wealth. Sometimes it's about relationships. Sometimes it's about morals. Sometimes it's about values. It's about being aware. It's about knowledge. It's about power. It's about all of those things. So when we talk about the idea of poverty, if you immediately go money, that's not necessarily the case. It's not always about money, which is, you would never get that unless you read the book. Okay, so then we get into this, the very last part of the book, and we hear Nick Carraway's judgment of Daisy. Like, he has this conversation with Tom, and Tom's like, you think I don't care, but I do care. I went back and picked up those dog bones and cried over them. And then Tom says something to the effect of like, what if I did tell him that fellow had it coming to him? He threw dust in your eyes just like he did Daisy. And this is Tom Buchanan talking about Gatsby. But he was a tough one. I'm on page 178. But he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you run over a dog and never even stopped his car. So he ran over Myrtle as though she's a dog. And the thing that reminds him of Myrtle is dog biscuits. So do you see the connection there? Like, perfectly timed connection there? And then Nick Carraway responds with, there is nothing I could say except the unutterable fact that it wasn't true. So there's nothing that I can say except I want to tell him that Daisy is the one who hit Myrtle. It wasn't Gatsby. It was Daisy. But he doesn't. Okay, so he lets that lie. And then he says, something to the extent of, I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. So this is Nick Carraway's view of these people. These people are rough people. They don't care about other people around them. They are, and I don't remember, I think it was in the chapter, maybe it's the end of this chapter, where he talks about people like Tom and Daisy just being rough. Like, they're rough with people, they're rough with objects. They don't care because they don't have to. They don't have to care about preserving something. They don't have to care about caring about something because they can just buy a new one. So it doesn't matter to them, right? And then we get to the very last page. So I'll give you a look. This is what my last page looks like. Because the last paragraph, the last couple of paragraphs of this book have been debated and debated and debated over. So I will tell you, and I will give you, here's my warning. This is my interpretation. I'm a philosophy minor, but my concentration in philosophy was largely like postmodern structuralist critique, feminist undertones. So like Judith Butler, Irigaray, Jacques Derrida, Ferdinand de Saussure, I have a very specific way of looking at that. So be aware that my lens is not necessarily your lens. And it's important that I say that because this paragraph, this page is so closely tied with how we define ourselves as Americans and like our understanding of Western ideal that I don't want to strip that from you. Like, it is absolutely essential that when you read this last page, that you understand that my interpretation of what is being said here is through my lens. And so I am just going to preface that and say, if you disagree with it wholeheartedly, awesome, good, you should, because it should be something that you've internalized for yourself, okay? All right, so I'm just gonna go through and I'm gonna start at the first full paragraph on page 180, the last page of the book. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of the ferry boat across the sound. So remember we talked about the idea of understanding the world around you. The number one sense that we use to understand the world around us is sight. So if we're talking about lenses, the way that we view the world, it's very important that we acknowledge that light, as it plays in the world around us, is the way that we understand truth, something to either be there or not be there, right? And again, if I had you guys in front of you, I would do this activity of you trying to prove to me that we're not dreaming right now, but I don't have you in front of me, so I can't do that. So he's describing the reality of the situation, but then the ferry boat, right? So ferry as in like non-real, as in dream, as in like little ferries that fly around, right? Because he's going to start stripping some of that reality away. And by stripping the reality away, he's actually taking us to the truth of the matter. So the truth is one of those things that you can't see, you have to kind of feel. You have to use like a transcendent nature to understand. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away. So remember, I told you it's going to be kind of dreamlike, right? So here we got into the dream aspect of it. The inessential houses began to melt away until I gradually became aware of the old island here that flowered once for the Dutch sailor's eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had once made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and the greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the first time in history with something commiserate to his capacity for wonder. This paragraph is the Platonic conception of the United States. When he's talking about the stripping away of the inessential houses, what makes America America, what makes the United States the United States are not the buildings. It's not the buildings, it's not the trees, it's not even really the people. It's the idea. It is the concept of what it means to be American. And that's what he's describing. So when we think back, like going back to the American dream, if we think about the old beauty of America and the dawn of the modern civilization, when the first Dutch settlers got here, why did they leave where they left? They left because they wanted to achieve something new and beautiful. And there's like this promise as they're coming onto this continent, this beautiful green continent. And it sounds like Garden of Eden, right? Which the United States, yeah, jungly, sure, but it was like a Garden of Eden. This is a fresh start. Like, we can do something we've never done before. We can create an entirely new world. It's a new world, right? So when we're talking about creating this new world, this is what he's describing. And then, so he compares this old, untainted, natural world, this Garden of Eden, with the waste of the modern world. So the houses are inessential and they melt away. And he's paralleling Gatsby to the original settlers, right? It's Gatsby's place, it's Gatsby's world. So like them, Gatsby hoped for something better and something too, and this is the quote that you need to focus on, live up to their capacity for wonder. The capacity for wonder is the Platonic conception, right? Our ability to have this dream, and that's what's gotten America through some of its toughest times, is our ability to invent. Our ability to be hopeful, our ability to get through, a Great Depression, to create wondrous things like planes and, all sorts of crazy, awesome inventions. It's because we have this optimism. And if you talk to people from other countries, that's one of the things that they admire about Americans, is we have great optimism, is that we're not sort of cynical and caught up in a history that has defined us as being not good enough, right? So the next paragraph is a further comparison between Gatsby and the new United States. It says, and I sat there brooding on the old unknown world. I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's Dock. Remember, I told you light is important because it's how we know the world around us. So for Gatsby, what he viewed as the point, the end of Daisy's Dock, the goal of everything, the view that he saw it was through the lens of green, and green equals money. So of course Gatsby's going to think that the way that he accomplishes this goal is to get money. And how do you get money? Well, you go through these very specific steps and you get those things, and then once you got them, then you've got the Platonic conception of self. But it's not what it lived up to be, because it's the Platonic conception of self. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. That's the problem, is that you can't grasp onto light. It's a concept. You can't hold onto light. You can't hold it. So the Platonic conception is not something that you can hold. Truth is not something you can hold. It changes from instance to instance to instance. And even with time changes from instance to instance to instance. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled under the night. Gatsby's dream of perfect Daisy, perfect life was in the past. The United States dream of perfection is something that we keep going towards. We keep constantly trying to get ourselves out of Plato's allegory of the cave, out of the cave of ignorance, but we are doing it through the lens of trying to be like the previous countries that we came from. If we're supposed to be rebelling against the idea of monarchy and feudalism, then why are we going towards autocracy? Why are we moving into a new feudal system that is just a feudal system with capitalism attached to it? How is that moving away from the old country? But if we don't move, then we're not alive. That's part of what makes us human beings. That's part of what makes us Americans. What makes us, part of this United States is our desire for progress. But if we're constantly progressing, then we're constantly not reflecting, right? And so it's a cycle. And I don't necessarily know that Fitzgerald can pull himself away long enough to say this is either good or bad. I think that he does a little bit of both. I think that he tries to shed light. It definitely is tainted with more, it shouldn't be this way. But maybe he's just commenting on human nature. Maybe he's commenting on our desire to have to move forward. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. Now when he says we, when Nick Carraway says we, he means you. He means you, the reader. You, the reader, are going to do this thing, because now he's pulling you into this, and he's saying all of us are aware that this thing does exist, but we're going to get better. We have to get better, all right? And it says, so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So the American dream becomes corrupt as soon as it's realized. The pure, untouched beauty that the original vision had disappeared and made way for whatever thing: consumerism, industrial development, power struggles, class systems, and the original dream was destroyed by its own future. Yet in order to thrive in order to thrive, both society and man must have desires and dreams, right? We can't be the lotus eaters and just sit around and not do anything all day. So Gatsby is the man that we as readers, when he says we meaning you, Nick Carraway, and you, the reader, and all of that Proustian metaphor tied up together, that's who we should cheer for in a world where dreams are gone. And he, Gatsby, he carries on believing in the future. Even as T.J. Eckleburg, the godlike figure, looks down and doesn't care anymore. What choice do you have? What else are you going to do? So he may be a deluded fool. Gatsby may be a deluded fool, but at least he risks everything for the chance of fulfillment, right? Look at his other options. Daisy is cynical, right? On the outside, she looks perfect, but inside she's got nothing. Myrtle sacrifices herself, body and soul, in order to try to climb this ladder. Tom feels completely and totally physically out of place, and mentally he's not stimulated at all. And his recourse for his own fear is to fall into things like racism, right? So what other choice do you have? Are you going to walk around this earth and just basically be like, everything sucks, and so I'm going to be awful too? No, you have to be Gatsby. You have to be Gatsby, and you have to move forward against the current of time, right? We all believe that we will be or should be like Gatsby, meaning that you are truly living by reaching for the dreams, even if they're essentially out of reach. So this is an argument that I used to tell my Lincoln Douglas debaters all of the time. Even if the justice system can never be perfect, it is impossible. It is absolutely, utterly impossible for the justice system to be perfect. That does not mean that you should stop trying to improve. So too, and this is something that I would tell my students, even if you know that you will never get an A in a class, that does not mean that you should stop trying in that class. Because you will better yourself just by getting better. And it's not about the A, it's not about the Platonic conception or the perfectness or any of those things. Progress in and of itself has its own reward. Now, can that be taken too far? Absolutely. And I'll give you a personal for instance. For me, I'm the type of person that reacts to things that are uncomfortable in my life by overworking. So I will literally work myself into a tizzy, and I will make myself sick by overworking because I feel like I'm making progress, but I'm not actually making progress. And in some cases, I'm making things far worse. So again, personal story. When I was training for my half marathon, I kept upping my mileage, and I started to feel shin splints, and I knew what the answer was. The answer for shin splints is rest. And you're not supposed to run on it. But I'm trying to prepare for this half marathon. And so I pushed it. And I was able to do the half marathon, but my time was terrible. And it was because I had worked myself so hard thinking that I was making progress, when in fact I was making things far worse. So that's one of the things that we as human beings, we as Americans have to deal with, is this idea that progress is not perfection. And the reason that we see this story through the lens of Nick is that Nick is aware of that, and he has the lens. He is the one who's able to see this world and say, I am aware of my own viewpoint. And that is what they argue is actually one of the highest levels of intellect, is to be aware of your own bias, right? And I think that's what Fitzgerald really wants us to be aware of, is when he says, born ceaselessly into the past, are you going to continue to make mistakes? Absolutely, right? But that doesn't mean you should stop. That doesn't mean that you should be cynical like Daisy, or you should throw your life away on small achievements like Myrtle, or you should, act in horribly racist ways like Tom. Like, don't embrace evil just because good is hard, right? And I think that's what we have to remember is the American dream. The true American dream, at least for me, and again, take this for what it is because it's my interpretation. I think what Fitzgerald is arguing is, whatever your idea of the American dream is, whether that's intellectual transcendence, whether it's monetary, whether it's power, the true American dream is being better. It's just being better tomorrow and the next day, and as a society, like, not sitting on your laurels, not resting on your laurels, and recognizing that, like, we've got some work to do. We always have work to do. Like, don't burn yourself out, but we've always got work to do. That to me is what it means to run faster and move farther, ceaselessly into the past. We're going to make the same mistakes. Yes, we're constantly going to try and get out of Plato's allegory of the cave, but at least we're trying to get out. So that's the end of Gatsby. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I will try and do some more of these types of videos for you guys if you're at all interested. If you are interested and you'd like me to do a critique like I've done with Gatsby with another book that maybe you're reading for an AP Lit class, or you just want to hear my take on something, let me know in the comments or email me at kohanimj@fultonschools.org, and let me know what you think. All right, have a good one. Bye.